The day started like any other for Maya, a bright and confident black teenager excited to pursue her dreams. But everything changed during a routine visit to a prominent doctor's office. As Maya sat patiently, she began to notice subtle and outright dismissive behavior from Dr. Harper, a man with an impressive resume but a heart clouded by prejudice. His tone was condescending, his words laced with assumptions that made her feel small and unwelcome. Maya, however, stayed composed. She knew her worth and decided to stand her ground. But things took a shocking turn when the doctor's words escalated into blatant discrimination. What Dr. Harper didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Maya's father held a position of incredible influence. When the truth about her dad's identity came to light, the shift in Dr. Harper's demeanor was almost immediate. Fear replaced arrogance, and his desperate attempts to apologize only deepened the tension in the room. What happened next would leave everyone stunned. Stay tuned to hear how this jaw-dropping encounter unfolded and the surprising twist that made Maya's story a lesson in justice and resilience. As Maya sat in stunned silence, Dr. Harper's panic was almost palpable. Just moments ago, he had dismissed her concerns with a smirk and a cold, judgmental tone. But now his confident facade was cracking. The name she had mentioned, her father's name, seemed to echo in his mind, unraveling everything he thought he knew about her. Maya didn't explain further, and that silence only made him more uneasy. Dr. Harper tried to regain control of the situation, but his words were stumbling now, filled with forced politeness that felt anything but genuine. Maya watched him carefully, her calm exterior masking the frustration and hurt she felt inside. She wasn't someone who sought revenge, but this moment felt bigger than her. It was about standing up to someone who had been using their position to demean others. In the waiting room, whispers had started to circulate among the staff and other patients. People had noticed the shift in the doctor's behavior, and it was clear this wasn't the first time his attitude had raised eyebrows. But what made Maya's case different? What was it about her that had shaken him so deeply? The room was tense, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Dr. Harper's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the clipboard, pretending to review Maya's file. The air in the room felt heavy, and Maya could see the cracks in his composure growing wider by the second. She wasn't sure what had caused his sudden change in demeanor, but she wasn't about to let him off the hook. After all, this wasn't just about her. It was about every patient who had probably been treated the same way, dismissed and belittled because they didn't fit his narrow expectations. Meanwhile, outside the office, the receptionist exchanged a knowing glance with one of the nurses. It wasn't the first time they'd seen Dr. Harper's prejudice surface, but it was the first time someone had confronted him in a way he couldn't brush aside. They couldn't hear the details of what was happening behind closed doors, but the sudden shift in his attitude had caught their attention. Back inside, Maya finally broke the silence. "You know," she said calmly, "you've made a lot of assumptions about me today. But I've learned something, too. People like you only respect power when it stares you in the face." Dr. Harper's face paled, but Maya wasn't finished. "The question is, what happens when the world finds out?" The tension was unbearable, but the story wasn't over yet. Dr. Harper's breath hitched as Maya's words hung in the air. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. He was used to being in control, to having the final say in every interaction. But now that control was slipping away, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His silence spoke volumes, and Maya could tell he was unraveling. The receptionist and nurse outside exchanged another look as the tension inside the room seemed to spill through the walls. Whispers grew louder among the patients waiting in the lobby. No one knew exactly what was happening, but they could sense something was off. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Inside, Maya decided to push a little further. "Do you treat everyone like this?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "Or is it just people who look like me?" Her words cut through the room like a blade, and Dr. Harper flinched. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Maya continued, "You should have thought twice before making assumptions today. You never know who's sitting in front of you or who's watching." Dr. Harper's face was pale now, his arrogance crumbling into desperation. Maya could see it, the realization that his actions might have consequences this time. She stayed composed, but inside, her emotions were swirling. The moment was reaching a breaking point, and both of them could feel it. But what would happen next was still unknown. Just as the tension reached its peak, there was a sudden knock on the door. The receptionist peeked in, her face a mixture of curiosity and urgency. "Dr. Harper, there's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly, glancing at Maya before retreating. Dr. Harper looked puzzled, then uneasy, as if he already knew this interruption wouldn't work in his favor. Moments later, the door swung open, and a tall man in a sharp suit stepped in. His commanding presence instantly shifted the energy in the room. It was Maya's father. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a silent authority that made even the overly confident Dr. Harper shrink. The doctor's mouth fell open slightly, and he stammered, "Mr. Daniels, I didn't realize." Maya's father didn't waste time. He turned to his daughter first, his voice warm and steady. "Are you all right, Maya?" She nodded, grateful for his support but determined to handle the situation on her terms. He then turned to Dr. Harper, and his expression hardened. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured but firm, "and I'd like to hear exactly how you've been treating my daughter." The room felt like it was closing in on Dr. Harper. His once confident demeanor was now fully replaced by nervousness. He fumbled for words, but before he could respond, Maya spoke again. "Maybe you can explain why you thought it was okay to treat me like I didn't matter," she said, her voice calm but piercing. Her father raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation. The silence was deafening, and it was clear this wasn't going to end without consequences. But what happened next would shock everyone, turning the situation into something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Harper's voice was shaky as he began to speak, attempting to explain himself. "Mr. Daniels, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. I never intended to." But Maya's father raised a hand to stop him. The room fell silent. "Let me make something clear," Mr. Daniels said, his voice calm but commanding. "What you intended doesn't matter. What matters is how you treated my daughter, disrespectfully and unfairly. And judging by the look on your face, this isn't the first time you've done it." Dr. Harper opened his mouth to object, but before he could say a word, the door opened again. This time, it was one of the nurses. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a folder. "I couldn't stay quiet anymore," she said softly. "Dr. Harper's behavior has been a problem for a long time. Patients have complained, but nothing's ever been done." The revelation sent a ripple through the room. Maya exchanged a look with her father, who nodded. "Thank you for speaking up," Mr. Daniels said to the nurse. "It takes courage to stand against someone in power." Turning back to Dr. Harper, he continued, "This stops now. I'll make sure of it." But just as Dr. Harper thought his fate was sealed, the final twist came. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation," she said, holding up the device, "and I think the world deserves to know the truth about how you treat people." Dr. Harper's face turned ashen. Any defense he might have had crumbled as the gravity of the situation hit him. The recording, the nurse's testimony, and Mr. Daniels' influence were more than enough to ensure accountability. As Maya and her father walked out, the whispers in the waiting room grew louder. Justice, it seemed, was finally catching up with Dr. Harper. But as Maya stepped into the fresh air, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. This was just the beginning of a much bigger change. As Maya and her father left the office, a sense of relief washed over her. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and made sure the people around her knew what had happened. It wasn't just about calling out one person. It was about breaking the silence around behavior that should never be tolerated. Outside, Mr. Daniels placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "You handled yourself with incredible strength in there," he said, pride clear in his voice. "I hope you know how powerful your voice is." Maya smiled softly, the tension from earlier finally easing. "I just couldn't let him get away with it," she replied. "Not for me, and not for anyone else." Back at the office, whispers among the staff continued to grow. The nurse who had spoken up felt a newfound courage, realizing that change might finally come. Dr. Harper, on the other hand, sat in his office knowing his actions were about to catch up with him. For Maya, this was more than a victory. It was a reminder of the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how intimidating it might feel. As she walked away with her father, she felt stronger, knowing she'd turned a painful moment into a powerful lesson in accountability and justice.